My lawyer wrote to me, "Call me immediately." He told me the terrible truth about my daughter. Those words still echo in my mind, burned into me like a scar that will never heal. I had just come in from the garden, still wearing the old gloves I used for pruning the roses. The house was quiet, eerily so, as if it already sensed what was about to happen. That morning, I found an envelope on the kitchen table. My lawyer's handwriting was scrawled across the front in an urgent, almost trembling hand. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. I remember the way my fingers hesitated before opening it. I had no reason to expect disaster, yet something in the way the ink dug into the paper made my stomach tighten. Inside, the message was short, almost abrupt. "Call me immediately. It concerns your daughter." My hand tightened around the letter. For a moment I thought it had to be a mistake, perhaps something trivial or legal paperwork he wanted me to sign. But my lawyer had always been a precise man, never dramatic, never careless with words. He wouldn't write like this unless something was truly dreadful. I reached for the phone with a trembling hand, my heart thudding in my chest as though I had been running. I dialed his number and waited. Each ring felt longer, heavier, as if time itself had slowed down to torment me. When he finally answered, his voice was clipped and grave. "You need to sit down," he said, and I obeyed without protest, lowering myself into the old wooden chair by the kitchen window. His tone was unlike anything I had heard from him before, a kind of cold weight that made me realize whatever truth he carried would not be something I could easily bear. Before he said another word, 1,000 questions erupted in my mind. What had my daughter done? Was she in danger? Was she hurt? The silence between us felt unbearable, as if the entire house was leaning in to listen. Finally, he spoke again. "It's about your estate, your property. There's something you need to know about your daughter." I felt the blood drain from my face. The room spun for a moment, the letter crumpled in my fist. My daughter, my only child, had always been the center of my life, the reason I worked, the reason I endured. She had been my pride, my joy, the one person I thought I could trust without question. To hear her name spoken in that dark, deliberate tone filled me with dread I could not describe. He paused, as if choosing his words carefully, then continued, "I discovered documents. She has been making moves without your knowledge, moves that could destroy everything you've worked for." My throat went dry. I wanted to shout, to demand details, but my voice betrayed me. All I managed was a hoarse whisper. "What are you saying?" He sighed, the sound heavy with pity. "I'm saying you need to prepare yourself. She isn't who you think she island." Those words broke something inside me. The kitchen around me seemed to collapse inward, the familiar walls closing in like a prison. My daughter, my flesh and blood, was at the center of a terrible secret, one my lawyer was still hesitant to fully reveal over the phone. I pressed the receiver against my ear, gripping it so tightly my knuckles turned white, and in that moment I knew my life was about to change forever. The letter still lay open on the table, its ink staring back at me like a warning carved in stone. I thought about all the years I had sacrificed, the nights spent working late to pay for her future, the quiet pride I felt watching her grow. And yet here I was, sitting in silence, realizing that everything I thought I knew about her might have been a lie. That call was the beginning. I didn't know it then, but the truth my lawyer carried would tear apart the very foundation of my family, exposing greed, betrayal, and lies so deep they would leave me questioning every memory I had of the daughter I once adored. When the lawyer finally steadied his voice and spoke, The words struck me harder than any physical blow ever could, because he revealed that my daughter had been working behind my back, forging and manipulating legal documents that concerned the very estate I had built with my own hands, the house, the land, the savings that represented an entire lifetime of sacrifice. And she had done it not out of need or desperation, but out of greed, the kind of greed that blinds people to love, loyalty, and decency. He told me she had colluded with her husband to draw up papers transferring ownership of my property, papers that, if left unchecked, would strip me of every right to my home and everything I had planned for the future. My lawyer explained that he discovered discrepancies while reviewing routine filings, things that did not add up, signatures that looked suspiciously like my own but carried small flaws he knew I would never make, and behind those forgeries was the name of my daughter, the very person I had trusted most in this world. I remember sitting there with the phone pressed to my ear, my pulse pounding in my temples, feeling like the floor beneath me was disintegrating. How could she? That question thundered inside me, but the lawyer's voice was relentless, steady, delivering the facts one after another like nails hammered into a coffin. He told me the plan was already advanced, that she had even arranged for her husband to serve as a witness in order to legitimize the documents, and that if I had not been alerted in time, the next step would have been irreversible. The betrayal cut deeper than words could capture. I thought of the nights I stayed awake balancing bills, of the years I denied myself comfort so that she could go to university without worry, of the countless times I placed her well-being above my own. And now to learn that she was plotting to rob me of everything I had earned, not even waiting for the natural course of life to unfold, but seeking to strip me while I still breathed, it was more than betrayal. It was a desecration of everything a father-daughter bond was supposed to mean. I clenched the arm of the chair so hard that my knuckles ached, struggling to control the storm raging inside me. My lawyer continued, his words deliberate, almost cautious, reminding me that we had a chance to stop it, that nothing had been finalized, but all I could hear was the echo of her voice in my memories, the laughter, the promises she once made, now all poisoned by the knowledge that she was capable of such cruelty. I could not bring myself to speak for a long while, and when I finally did, my voice trembled as I asked him if there could be any mistake. He was silent for a moment before answering, and in that silence I already knew the truth, but when he said, "I'm afraid not, the evidence is irrefutable," my heart broke in a way I had never thought possible. The letter on the table, the phone in my hand, the walls around me, everything seemed unreal, like I had been thrust into a nightmare I could not wake from. I had faced hardship before, but nothing like this, nothing that reached into the deepest part of me and ripped out my trust, my pride, my love as a father. That day, in that moment, I realized that my daughter, the person I thought I knew better than anyone, had betrayed me in the most devastating way imaginable, and though grief threatened to overwhelm me, another force began to stir quietly inside, a force that would grow stronger with every passing hour, the resolve to ensure she would not succeed. The phone slipped from my hand and clattered onto the table, the lawyer's voice fading into the background as though it were coming from the bottom of a well, and I just sat there in stunned silence, staring at the letter that had brought me this far, unable to believe that my own daughter had taken a knife to the very trust that bound us together. I had weathered storms in my life, countless hardships, but nothing prepared me for this kind of devastation, the kind that does not wound the body, but instead shatters the spirit. My eyes drifted to the walls of my home, every corner filled with memories I had built through sacrifice. I remembered when she was a child how I worked long hours at a factory, coming home drenched in sweat and exhaustion, yet always finding a smile for her, always saving the last coin for her happiness, never for myself. I had built this house brick by brick, board by board, so she would never know what it meant to be without shelter, and I had gone without new clothes or vacations so she could walk into school with pride. I thought of the nights I sat up at the kitchen table counting out crumpled bills to cover her textbooks, tuition, and the endless expenses that come with giving a child a chance at life. Every time I told myself it was worth it, that her future mattered more than my comfort, that a father's role was to give until he had nothing left. My heart pounded as those memories clashed with the truth the lawyer had revealed, and I felt like I was watching my entire life unravel in front of me. All those sacrifices, every drop of sweat and every sleepless night, had been made with faith that she would carry them with gratitude, that she would protect what I had built. But instead she had chosen greed over love, betrayal over loyalty. My trust, once as solid as stone, crumbled like dust in my hands, leaving me hollow. I tried to make sense of it, to convince myself that maybe she had been pressured, maybe it was a mistake, but no amount of rationalizing could cover the cold reality that she had knowingly plotted to strip me of everything I had. I replayed her smile in my mind, the way she used to say, "Thank you, Dad," and the memory stung like acid, because now I wondered if those words had ever been genuine, or if they had only been rehearsed lines in a performance meant to keep me blind. I had lived my entire life believing that my devotion would be enough to build a bond that could not be broken, but in that silence after the call, I realized bonds are fragile when weighed against greed. The silence in the house pressed down on me, heavier than any shouting could have been, every tick of the clock mocking me with its indifference. I felt my trust shatter piece by piece, each memory turning from warm to cold, from sweet to bitter, and as the weight of it sank in, I understood that something inside me had changed forever. The man who had once believed love alone was enough had died in that moment, replaced by someone who would no longer allow himself to be deceived so easily. I sat frozen in my chair, the air around me thick with betrayal, and as I tried to steady my breathing, my mind began to drift back through the corridors of memory, replaying the sacrifices that had shaped my life and hers. I remembered the earliest days when I was just a young man with nothing but a strong back and calloused hands, taking any work I could find because I wanted my daughter to grow up in a home that was hers, not in some rented space that could be taken away at any moment. I would rise before dawn, my body aching from the day before, and spend 12 hours hauling lumber, pouring concrete, doing the kind of work that leaves your muscles screaming and your clothes soaked through with sweat, but every swing of the hammer, every nail driven into the wood of the house I was building, I carried her image in my mind. I saw her running across the yard that did not yet exist, laughing as the walls I raised became the backdrop of her childhood, and that vision kept me going when exhaustion threatened to break me. When the house was finally finished, not a mansion but a strong, warm home, I stood outside one evening and looked at it with pride, knowing I had built it not for myself, but for her, so she would always have roots, always know she belonged somewhere. As she grew, so did the weight of responsibility. Education was everything, and I swore she would never know the embarrassment of sitting in class without the right books or clothes. I remember the nights I worked extra shifts, sometimes 2 jobs, just so she could go on school trips or have the supplies she needed. I denied myself meals so she could eat better. I wore the same pair of worn-out shoes for 5 years so she could walk into school with new ones each September, her head held high. When she was accepted into university, I thought my chest would burst with pride, but I also knew the crushing financial burden that came with it. Still, I never hesitated. I emptied savings accounts, took on loans, and worked myself into the ground to pay tuition. I can still see myself sitting at the kitchen table, stacks of bills spread out before me, a single dim lamp casting shadows over the numbers that never seemed to add up, and yet I always found a way. I did it because she was my daughter, my blood, my reason for enduring. Every sacrifice was worth it. When I saw her succeed, each graduation, each achievement, each moment she smiled with genuine joy, made the years of struggle feel small. But what eats at me now is the question that refuses to leave my mind. Did she ever truly see what I gave? Did she ever understand the cost of her opportunities? The nights I lay awake with worry, the times I bit back hunger, the times my body screamed for rest, but I pushed through? Or was I only ever a stepping stone, a resource to be used until it was dry? Sitting in that silent house, I felt the weight of those sacrifices pressing down on me harder than ever before. They were supposed to be the foundation of trust and gratitude between a father and a daughter, yet now they felt like chains around my chest. Each memory, a reminder that I had poured everything into her only to be repaid with treachery. I thought of the years gone by, the laughter, the tears, the dreams I held for her, and each one turned bitter in my mouth. The weight of my sacrifices was no longer a source of pride. It had become the very measure of my heartbreak, proof that the more I gave, the more devastating her betrayal had become. Looking back now, I can see the signs that I chose to ignore, the small cracks in her character that should have warned me long ago, moments when she dismissed me, belittled me, or acted as though she was entitled to everything I had worked for. But at the time I brushed them aside, convincing myself she was just young, just reckless, that she would grow out of it. I remember the first time she came home from school, embarrassed by the old truck I drove, its paint chipped and engine groaning, and instead of gratitude that her father had spent the day working overtime to make sure she had her new shoes and school supplies, she rolled her eyes and told me I should be ashamed to pick her up in such a thing. The words cut me deeply. Though I laughed it off and told her one day I would buy something better, but I carried the sting with me for weeks. Then there was the time she invited friends over while I was outside mending the fence by hand, my clothes torn and my hands blistered, and I overheard her whisper that I was just an old man who never did anything important, that she wished her life was like her friends whose fathers wore suits and drove shiny cars. I stood there, hammer in hand, pretending I had not heard, but inside I felt something break, a small fracture in the bond I had so carefully nurtured. There were dinners when I tried to talk about my day, about the extra hours I had taken to cover her tuition, and she would wave her hand dismissively, too busy with her phone, too focused on her own world to care about the sacrifices that kept her comfortable. I told myself it was just the impatience of youth, that all children go through phases of selfishness, but deep down I knew the lack of respect was not just a phase. She would complain about the house, the very one I had built with sweat dripping from my brow, saying it was too small, too plain, not good enough for her friends to see. I recall one bitter evening when I told her about the years I had spent building that home brick by brick, and instead of gratitude, she sneered and said it looked like nothing more than an old shack compared to what others had. Her words left me silent, staring at the table while she stormed off, and though I told myself she did not mean it, the memory stayed lodged like a splinter in my heart. As she grew older, the dismissals only deepened. When she came back from university, dressed in clothes I had paid for, Walking with the confidence that only my sacrifices had made possible, she spoke down to me as though I were beneath her. I remember her telling her friends that her life would finally begin once she inherited everything, saying it as though I were nothing more than a stepping stone between her and the future she believed she deserved. I should have taken those words for the warning they were, but love blinded me, hope silenced me, and I convinced myself she would change, that one day she would see all I had done and finally give me the respect and gratitude I longed for. But those moments, those cruel little glimpses into her true self, were not just slips of the tongue or youthful arrogance. They were the first signs of the betrayal that would one day come crashing down on me, and though I ignored them then, I cannot ignore them now. My lawyer's voice carried the weight of 1,000 storms as he laid out the details of what my daughter had been orchestrating behind my back, and with every word, the picture of her treachery grew sharper, uglier, more devastating than I could ever have imagined. He explained that she had not acted alone, that her husband had been just as deeply involved, the two of them working together in cold calculation to strip me of the estate I had built with my own 2 hands. They had been meeting with notaries, drafting documents, and carefully forging my signature on forms that would transfer ownership of my property to them. It was not a mistake, not some accidental oversight, but a deliberate plan hatched in secrecy, a conspiracy that spoke of greed and contempt. My lawyer said he had found paperwork filed under my name but riddled with inconsistencies that caught his trained eye, little details that seemed off until he investigated further. What he uncovered left no room for doubt. My daughter and her husband had fabricated witness statements, falsified dates, and gone so far as to mimic the notations I normally made on legal documents, as if they had studied my handwriting, my habits, waiting for the moment when I was most vulnerable. Their plan was simple but devastating. They wanted everything: the house, the land, the savings, the future I had built from decades of sweat and sacrifice. They had prepared to move swiftly, ensuring that once the documents were finalized, there would be no legal recourse for me. My lawyer's words painted the betrayal in stark colors, each sentence a blow that left me reeling. He told me that the husband had been the one pushing hardest, using his connections to grease the wheels and finding people willing to look the other way for a price, but my daughter was no passive participant. She had signed her name boldly, arrogantly, as though she had already buried me and claimed her inheritance before my body was cold. The thought of her sitting at a table, pen in hand, calmly erasing me from my own legacy while I still lived, made bile rise in my throat. My lawyer's tone turned colder still when he explained that if we had not caught the trail when we did, in a matter of weeks, I would have been legally stripped of every right to the home I built, reduced to a tenant in the house where I had raised her, or worse, thrown out entirely. I struggled to breathe as I listened, my hand gripping the edge of the table, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear. This was not just greed, it was erasure, a deliberate attempt to make me nothing, to take my life's work and rewrite it as theirs, as though I had never existed. My mind reeled at the enormity of it, but the lawyer's steady voice kept me tethered, reminding me that though their plan was cunning, it was not yet complete, and that I still had the chance to fight back. Yet even as he assured me of that, I could not escape the image of my daughter, the child I once held in my arms, now plotting with her husband to rob me blind, to steal not only my possessions, but my dignity. It was a hidden plan, yes, but now it stood exposed, and with its exposure came the realization that the blood ties I had trusted all my life had been severed by her own hand. When the call ended, I remained seated in that chair, the receiver still in my hand, though the line had long gone dead, and the silence that filled the room pressed against me with a suffocating weight I could not escape, a silence so heavy it seemed to mock me with every second that ticked by. The house that once felt alive with laughter and the warmth of family now stood hollow and cold, its walls echoing back my despair, and I realized that the place I had built with my blood and sweat had become a tomb for the trust I once held sacred. My hands began to shake uncontrollably, the letter crumpling in my grip, and though I tried to steady myself, the truth tore through me like a jagged blade. My daughter, my only child, the very reason I had endured decades of hardship, had chosen greed over love, treachery over loyalty, and I could not fathom how the same girl who once clutched my hand at the park and whispered that she never wanted me to leave her side could grow into a woman capable of plotting my destruction. The silence in the house was unbearable, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing as I fought against the storm rising inside me. My chest tightened, and I felt the sting of tears welling in my eyes, hot and unrelenting, until they spilled over and traced down my face. I did not weep softly. I collapsed forward, pressing my forehead against the table, my body racked with sobs that seemed to tear from the deepest part of my soul. I cried not only for the betrayal but for the years that now felt wasted, for the sacrifices that had turned to ash, for the love that had been trampled beneath her ambition. The chair creaked beneath me, the floor cold under my feet, the air thick with the smell of dust and old wood, and every detail of my surroundings seemed to magnify the emptiness inside me. The home I had built to shelter her felt alien, as though I were a stranger trespassing in a place that no longer belonged to me. I thought of all the nights I had walked through these halls, whispering prayers for her health and happiness, and now those prayers felt like cruel jokes whispered to a God who had turned his back. The silence deepened, and with it came the memories, unbidden and merciless. Her laughter as a child, the first time she called me Daddy, the way her small hands reached out to me when she was afraid of the dark. Each memory, once a source of joy, now cut into me like shards of glass, because they belonged to a girl who no longer existed, replaced by someone I did not know, someone who saw me not as a father, but as an obstacle in her path to wealth. My sobs subsided into a hollow stillness, my body drained of strength, and I sat motionless, staring into nothing, the weight of betrayal crushing me into silence. In that stillness, I felt something die inside me. Not my love for her, for love never dies easily, but the trust that had been its foundation, the trust that had once made me believe she would always stand by me. Alone in that empty house, I realized that I was no longer a father in her eyes. I was only an old man to be discarded, a stepping stone to her ambition, and that realization hollowed me out until all that remained was the echo of my grief in the silence that surrounded me. The tears eventually dried on my cheeks, leaving behind a hollow ache that throbbed in my chest, and for a time I sat in that suffocating silence, staring at nothing, too exhausted to move. But slowly, something began to shift inside me. A spark buried beneath the rubble of my grief, a spark that glowed hotter with each memory of her betrayal. At first, it was just anger at the thought of her sitting with her husband, laughing about their cleverness, daring to think I would be too blind, too old, too weak to notice what they were doing. But then that anger hardened into something sharper, colder, a resolve that steadied my trembling hands and straightened my spine. I thought of the house I had built, every nail driven by my own hand, every brick laid with sweat pouring down my back, and I swore I would not let them take it from me. I thought of the nights I went hungry so she could eat, The years I walked in worn shoes so she could have new ones, the countless hours I spent laboring to secure her education and her future, and I promised myself that those sacrifices would not be stolen or erased by greed. The more I replayed the betrayal, the less power grief had over me, and the more fiercely determination took its place. They believed me to be weak, a man too broken by love to defend himself, but they had forgotten that I am the one who endured decades of toil, that I am the one who knows how to survive hardship, and that nothing fuels strength like betrayal. I clenched my fists until my nails dug into my palms. The sting ground in me, reminded me that I was still here, still breathing, still capable of fighting back. I whispered to the empty room that they would not win. Not this time, not over my dead body, and the sound of my own voice, low and steady, felt like a vow carved into stone. The grief had burned me, but the flames left behind steel, and I knew in that moment that my daughter and her husband would come to regret underestimating me. I would not scream or beg. I would not crumble before their schemes. I would use every ounce of cunning I possessed, every tool the law offered me, and I would turn their plan back on them until they were the ones left in ruins. My home was not just wood and stone. It was the embodiment of my life, my sacrifices, my dignity, and no one would take it from me. I felt my heart beat stronger, steadier, and though the silence of the house still loomed, it no longer mocked me, for now it bore witness to my resolve. From the ashes of my hurt rose a cold and unyielding determination, and in that moment I swore that I would fight, and I would win. The next morning I walked into my lawyer's office with the weight of the world pressing down on my shoulders, but beneath that weight was the cold fire that had taken root inside me, and though my hand still trembled slightly, it was not from despair any more, but from the restrained fury that demanded action. My lawyer greeted me with the same calm professionalism that had always defined him, his sharp eyes studying me as though measuring how much I had endured and how much fight remained in me. He gestured for me to sit, and as I lowered myself into the chair across from his desk, I felt the steadiness of his presence begin to anchor me. He did not waste time with pleasantries. Instead, he laid out the facts once more with clinical precision, confirming the extent of my daughter's and her husband's scheme, pointing to forged documents, falsified dates, and their attempted manipulation of the legal system. His tone was not emotional, not condemning, but clear and methodical, and in that clarity I found a strange comfort, for it told me that betrayal, as painful as it was, could be countered with strategy. He explained the paths available to us. We could immediately challenge the documents, exposing the forgery in court, or we could build a stronger case by letting their plan advance further, gathering undeniable proof of their intent and malice before striking. He spoke of injunctions, of freezing assets, of drawing on witnesses who would confirm my whereabouts on dates they had falsified, and with each option he presented, I felt a new layer of armor forming around me. He reminded me that the law was not on their side, that deception leaves trails no matter how carefully covered, and that their arrogance would be their undoing. I listened carefully, my grief momentarily pushed aside by the sharpness of his words, and when he placed a folder of evidence before me, detailing the cracks already visible in their scheme, I felt the first stirrings of hope. I asked him quietly what he truly recommended, and he leaned back in his chair, folding his hands, his gaze unwavering. In a calm but decisive voice, he advised patience and precision, telling me that while we could stop them immediately, the greater justice would come from allowing them to reveal the full scope of their betrayal letting them walk deeper into their own trap until the case against them was irrefutable and devastating. His composure in the face of their malice steadied my resolve further, and as I absorbed his counsel, I realized that my fight would not be one of rage, but of discipline, a battle not only for my property but for my dignity. I left his office with a strategy forming in my mind, carrying the weight of his words like a shield, and as I stepped into the daylight, I felt the first sense of control return to me. Knowing that I was no longer just a victim, but a man preparing for war. From that day forward, my life became a careful act of vigilance and silence. For while my heart still ached with the weight of betrayal, my mind had shifted into a new state of purpose, and every waking hour was devoted to gathering the proof that would expose my daughter and her husband for what they truly were. I began at home, pulling out decades of records I had kept neatly stored in boxes, receipts, tax filings, contracts, every signature I had ever made on a legal document, each page a small piece of armor in the defense I was building. Long nights found me hunched over the table, my lamp casting a pale circle of light as I compared my true handwriting to the crude forgeries they had attempted, and though the differences were clear to me, I knew that to a court the evidence needed to be irrefutable, undeniable, the kind of truth that even their arrogance could not twist. I organized everything meticulously, labeling and dating until my once quiet house looked less like a home and more like an archive of betrayal. But it was not just the documents that revealed their treachery, it was their words, the casual cruelty I began to overhear when they thought I was not listening. I remember one afternoon when my daughter and her husband came to visit, their smiles false, their tones sweet as honey when directed at me, but later I caught them whispering in the kitchen when they believed I was outside. I stood just beyond the doorway, my breath shallow, my heart hammering, and I heard her say that once everything was signed and finalized, they could finally get rid of me, that she was tired of waiting for me to die. Her husband laughed, cold and mocking, telling her that soon I would have nothing, that the house I built with my hands would belong entirely to them, and they spoke with such certainty, such disdain, that I felt both fury and clarity in equal measure. It was no longer a suspicion or a fear, it was fact, spoken from their own lips, and though the words pierced me like knives, I held on to them as weapons, for I knew I could use their arrogance against them. I began to keep a small recorder in my pocket, careful and discreet, capturing snippets of their conversations when they slipped and revealed too much, and soon I had more than enough to show not only intent, but malice, their complete lack of respect for me, their calculated plan to strip me of my legacy. Each recording was a dagger I tucked away, and with every one I collected, my sorrow hardened further into resolve. I copied bank statements, tracked inconsistencies in their movements, and even uncovered payments they had made to a notary willing to look the other way. The deeper I dug, the more grotesque their betrayal became, and though it burned me to face it, the fire only forged me stronger. Alone in the silence of my home, I listened again and again to their voices dripping with contempt, and each time I promised myself that soon those voices would be silenced by the weight of truth. By the time I closed the last box of records and placed the last tape in my drawer, I knew I had built an arsenal, not of weapons but of evidence, and that when the day came to strike there would be no escape for them, no denial, only the cold, hard reality of their own words and actions, crushing them beneath the justice they thought I would never dare to seek. I did not want to believe that the girl I once carried on my shoulders, the child whose laughter filled my life with meaning, had truly become the kind of person my lawyer described But the more I uncovered and the more I overheard, the more undeniable her true nature became, and each revelation peeled away the last fragile layers of love-blinded denial until I was staring straight into the heart of her greed and arrogance. One evening I stood outside the house she shared with her husband, the window slightly ajar, and their voices carried clearly into the night air. I heard her speak with a tone so sharp, so filled with contempt, that it chilled me to my core. She said she was tired of waiting, tired of playing the dutiful daughter, and that soon the house, the land, and the money would be hers, and that when that day came she would not have to put up with me anymore. Her husband laughed in agreement, telling her she deserved it all, and she answered with a cruel chuckle that I was nothing but a burden clinging stubbornly to life, that I had already served my purpose and should step aside. Those words sank into me like poison, and though I wanted to storm in and confront her, I forced myself to remain still, to listen, to gather her truth in its rawest form. Her words dragged me back into memories I had long suppressed, moments that now carried a darker meaning than I once gave them. I remembered her 15th birthday when I worked 2 extra shifts to afford the necklace she had begged for, and instead of gratitude, she frowned, saying it was not the one she had wanted, that I should have tried harder, that other fathers did better. I remembered how she returned from university and dismissed my home as a shabby relic, rolling her eyes at the creaking floors I had once polished with pride, muttering that she could not wait until it was finally hers to remodel. Even when I offered her help when she first married, given her money to cover the down payment for her new life, she did not thank me but complained that it was not enough, that she expected more from a father who claimed to love her. I had buried these memories beneath excuses, telling myself she was young, stressed, unaware of the weight of her words, but now I saw them for what they truly were, early glimpses of the arrogance and entitlement that had festered inside her all along. The recordings I collected were even worse, her voice dripping with venom as she confided to her husband that she wished I would just pass on so the inheritance could be settled, mocking me for still clinging to life, laughing about how pathetic I looked when I stumbled home from work in my worn clothes. She spoke of me not as a father but as an obstacle, a barrier between her and the wealth she believed was hers by right. She called me useless, outdated, stubborn, a burden who had nothing left to give. Each time I listened to those words, my chest burned, my heart ached, but alongside the pain was clarity, because at last there was no doubt, no illusions, no wishful thinking. The daughter I once adored, the child I sacrificed everything for, had revealed herself fully, and what I saw was a woman who had erased every bond of love and replaced it with greed. Her true colors were not hidden anymore, and they were ugly, selfish, and cruel, and though it shattered what was left of my heart, it also gave me the fuel I needed to continue my fight, for I now knew that she had already abandoned me long before I discovered her plot. Once the veil had been ripped away and my daughter's true nature lay bare before me, there was no longer any space for hesitation or denial, only the cold necessity of action, and together with my lawyer, I began to construct a plan that would not only protect what was mine, but also ensure that she and her husband would face the full weight of justice. My lawyer was meticulous, laying out every step with the precision of a man who had waged battles like this before, and I sat across from him absorbing every detail, committing myself fully to the path ahead. The first step was safeguarding my assets, locking down accounts, transferring titles into protected trusts that could not be tampered with, and placing every piece of my estate under the watchful eye of the law so that their forged documents would crumble when held against the real ones. I spent long evenings signing affidavits, compiling notarized statements, and confirming with banks and agencies that no unauthorized changes could slip through. Every signature I placed felt like a brick in the fortress I was building around my life's work. But defense was only half the plan. Offense mattered too, and here my lawyer's strategic mind shone brightest. He suggested we allow them to continue, to think they were still ahead, all while we gathered irrefutable evidence of their intent and malice. He arranged for investigators to monitor their financial activities, to trace the money they had spent bribing notaries and clerks, to record their meetings where they boasted of what they believed they would soon own. Every arrogant word they spoke became ammunition, every slip of their tongue a nail in their coffin. I contributed as well, providing the recordings I had captured, the notes I had written, the memories that aligned with their lies. My lawyer listened carefully, piecing everything together until the picture was clear. Not only were they thieves, but they were also reckless, their greed making them careless in ways that would doom them once the case reached the courts. We crafted scenarios, rehearsed confrontations, planned for every possible defense they might attempt. He explained how we would present the forgeries, line by line, against my authenticated signatures, how we would summon the witnesses they had tried to manipulate and reveal their false statements under scrutiny, and how, once all was said and done, their credibility would be destroyed beyond repair. I listened, my resolve deepening with each word, and for the first time since the betrayal, I felt a measure of strength return to me. Because I was no longer reacting to their cruelty, I was preparing to strike back. The plan became my lifeline, something I clung to when the nights grew heavy with sorrow. Each document filed, each strategy discussed, each piece of evidence secured became a step away from despair and a step toward vindication. My lawyer reminded me again and again that patience would be our greatest weapon, that letting them grow bolder would only tighten the rope around their necks, and I agreed, even though it meant enduring their false smiles and poisoned words a little longer. I would let them believe they were winning. I would let them grow drunk on their imagined triumph, and then, when the time was right, I would pull the ground out from under them. It was not just about keeping my home or my savings. It was about reclaiming my dignity, proving that I was not the weak old man they thought I was. The plan was meticulous, calculated, unyielding, and as we sealed the final folders and locked away the evidence, I swore silently to myself that when the day of reckoning came, my daughter and her husband would learn that betrayal has a cost, and that I was prepared to make them pay it in full. In the days that followed, I wrapped myself in a mask so carefully crafted that not even my daughter, with all her arrogance and suspicion, could pierce it, for I knew that if she sensed even a hint of my awareness, her scheme might shift, and the opportunity to expose her would slip away. And so I played the part of the oblivious father, smiling at her false sweetness, nodding politely when her husband made smug remarks, and all the while my heart burned with the knowledge of what they were truly plotting. Each visit became a test of endurance, for she grew bolder with every passing day, no longer hiding her disdain as much as before, making sharper demands, hinting at how much easier life would be once certain matters were finally settled. I would sit quietly at the table, sipping my tea, letting her believe that her words passed over me without consequence, but inside I was memorizing every phrase, every careless slip, every look of contempt she cast my way. She asked me to sign papers casually slipped among household bills, her tone sweet and rehearsed, and I would feign confusion, laugh it off, pretend my eyes were too tired to read, while knowing full well the trap she was setting. I refused without ever seeming to refuse, steering conversations away, distracting her with stories of the past, and though she rolled her eyes impatiently, she never guessed that I was protecting myself with precision. Her husband was worse, always circling like a vulture, making comments about how much space I had in the house, how perhaps it was time I considered moving somewhere smaller, somewhere more appropriate for a man of my age. He would smirk when he said it, testing my reactions, and I would chuckle softly, pretending not to notice the venom beneath his words. It was not easy to endure, for each comment was a reminder of the contempt they held for me, but I knew patience was my greatest weapon. The plan my lawyer and I had devised depended on letting them feel confident, letting them push further into their own arrogance until the evidence was undeniable. So I bore their words, their schemes, their dismissive laughter, all the while keeping my mask firmly in place. At night, when the house was empty again, I would sit in the silence, my mask finally set aside, and feel the fury and sorrow surge within me. But I reminded myself again and again that justice was being woven in those very moments, that every cruel remark they made while believing me blind was another thread binding them to their downfall. They thought they had me fooled, they thought I was weak, but what they did not realize was that the calm they saw was only the surface, and beneath it a storm was gathering, silent but unstoppable, a storm that would one day sweep away their arrogance and leave them exposed before the world. It happened on a gray afternoon when the clouds hung low and heavy, pressing down on the world as though they sensed what was about to unfold, and my daughter arrived with her husband carrying the same polished smiles they always wore when they wanted something. But this time there was no pretense of subtlety in her actions, no delicate dance of persuasion, only raw arrogance, as she laid a stack of papers in front of me and demanded that I sign them. She spoke as if it were a simple matter, her tone clipped and impatient, saying it was just to simplify things, that it was better for the family if everything was under her control, and she looked at me not with the eyes of a daughter, but with the cold, assessing gaze of someone who saw nothing but an obstacle to be removed. Her husband leaned casually against the wall, arms crossed, smirking as though the outcome were already assured, as though I were too frail and bewildered to resist. I stared down at the papers, recognizing immediately the familiar pattern of their forgeries, the subtle mimicry of my signature, and though my heart pounded with rage, I forced myself to remain calm, to wear the same mask I had perfected. But this time something inside me cracked. She leaned closer, her voice dripping with condescension, telling me that I was making things harder than they needed to be, that she had been patient long enough. And then she said the words that shattered any remaining illusion of love between us. "You've had your life, now let me have mine." The silence that followed was sharp and suffocating, but before I could answer, her husband added fuel to the fire, sneering that I should be grateful she was even including me in the decision, that most men my age were already irrelevant, living off their children instead of clinging stubbornly to what should rightfully pass on. I felt the blood rush to my face, my hands trembling not from fear, but from the sheer force of anger pressing against the dam of restraint I had held for so long. I pushed the papers back across the table slowly, deliberately, and when I finally spoke, my voice was steady but laced with steel. I told her I would not sign, not now, not ever, and the look of shock that crossed her face quickly twisted into fury. She raised her voice, shouting that I was selfish, that I was ruining her future, that all my sacrifices meant nothing if I would not hand everything over now. Her words spilled like acid, each one erasing the years of love I had carried for her, and for the first time I did not flinch. I did not swallow the pain. I let the fire burn openly in my eyes. The confrontation erupted in a storm of raised voices, her insults clashing with my quiet refusals, her husband's mocking laughter ringing through the house. But beneath their noise, I felt an unexpected calm take hold of me. This was the final straw, the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when their arrogance revealed itself so nakedly that it could no longer be hidden. I realized then that I did not need to act out of anger but out of certainty, for their downfall was already in motion, and their own greed was the rope tightening around their necks. I stood slowly, meeting her gaze without wavering, and told her in a low voice that one day very soon she would understand the true cost of betrayal. She scoffed, dismissing my words as the empty threats of an old man, but deep inside me the vow had already solidified into unshakable resolve. They believed they had broken me, that their pressure would force me to yield, but what they had done instead was awaken the storm fully, and as they left that day in anger, their scheme once again delayed. I knew the time for masks was drawing to an end, and the day of reckoning was closer than they could ever imagine. After that final confrontation, I knew there was no longer any use in playing the naive father who did not understand the weight of the papers shoved before him, and though outwardly I kept my calm silence, inwardly, every piece of the plan my lawyer and I had built began to click into place like the teeth of a well-oiled machine, each maneuver calculated to protect what was mine, and to ensure that when the time came, their betrayal would not only fail but collapse back upon them with devastating force. The first step was the trusts. Airtight and beyond their reach, every property deed, every bank account, every savings certificate transferred under legal guardianship that recognized only my authority, rendering their forgeries nothing more than scraps of worthless paper. My lawyer guided me through each process with surgical precision, his voice steady as he explained how every signature was being notarized and time-stamped so that not even the most corrupt official could dispute its validity. At the same time, injunctions were quietly filed, invisible walls erected in the courts that barred any unauthorized claims against my estate, a protection so strong that even if they tried to push their falsified documents through the system, they would find doors slammed shut in their faces. Yet the trap was not just about defense. It was about patience, about letting them believe the road ahead was still open, that their plan remained hidden, while in reality every step they took only dug their own grave deeper. I signed nothing they presented, of course, but I did so with feigned confusion and distraction, never revealing that the papers I refused had already been flagged and registered with legal authorities. I let them think they were clever, that my hesitations were weakness, and that soon I would break beneath their pressure. Meanwhile, investigators followed their movements, recording meetings, tracing payments to the notary they had bribed, cataloging every careless boast they made when they thought no one was listening. Each detail, each piece of evidence was quietly funneled into the growing arsenal my lawyer was assembling, a case so watertight that when it was finally revealed there would be no escape, no plea, no denial that could save them. The most painful yet most vital part of the trap was my silence. I endured their arrogance a little longer, nodded through their cutting remarks, pretended to be the frail and confused old man they believed me to be, all so they would not alter their scheme before the walls closed in. At night, when the house was silent and I was alone, I would open the folders my lawyer had given me, run my fingers across the stamped seals, and remind myself that each page was a shield, each record a blade, and that together they formed a fortress no betrayal could breach. My daughter thought she had outsmarted me, that she had already stolen what was mine, but the truth was that every move she made only bound her tighter to the noose she had woven with her own hands. The trap was set, silent, and merciless, and I knew that when it finally snapped shut, it would not simply stop her plan, it would turn her arrogance into her undoing, and she would be forced to face the one truth she had never considered, that I was far stronger than she ever imagined. The day of reckoning arrived not with thunder, but with the quiet inevitability of a storm that had been gathering too long to be denied. And when my daughter and her husband walked into my house wearing those smug expressions that once made my stomach turn with grief, I felt no sorrow this time, only the cold steadiness of a man who knew the truth was finally ready to be revealed. She carried yet another set of papers in her hand, her tone sharp as she demanded once again that I sign, and when I refused, she slammed them down on the table, her voice rising with anger as she accused me of being stubborn, selfish, unwilling to think of her future. Her husband sneered from the corner, repeating the same tired insults, telling me that I was too old to manage things, that I should be grateful they were willing to take the burden from me. I let their words spill out, calm and silent, my hands folded neatly in front of me, and when at last they paused, expecting me to bend, I raised my eyes and spoke with a clarity that cut through their arrogance like a blade. I told them I knew everything. I told them I knew about the forged signatures, the falsified dates, the bribes paid to the notary who had now confessed under oath, the bank transfers traced back to their accounts, the recordings of their own voices mocking me and boasting of what they believed they would soon own. At first my daughter laughed, a brittle sound that echoed harshly in the room, but as I opened the folder I had prepared and laid out document after document, transcript after transcript, her face drained of color. Her husband tried to bluster, to sneer that none of it would hold up, but when I revealed that the injunctions had already been filed, that every piece of my estate was locked under legal protection, his voice faltered and died. The silence that followed was thick with their shock, and I watched my daughter's eyes dart across the evidence spread before her, her arrogance crumbling into disbelief. She stammered, asking how I could possibly know, how I could have done all this without them suspecting, and I leaned forward, my voice low but steady, telling her that while she saw me as a weak old man, she had forgotten who I truly was, the man who had built this house with his bare hands, the man who had survived decades of hardship, the man who could not be broken by betrayal but only sharpened by it. She tried to reach for the papers, to scatter them in desperation, but I pulled them back, locking eyes with her as I told her it was too late, that the law already knew, that soon everyone would know, and that the future she had dreamed of had already crumbled to dust. Her husband cursed under his breath, his bravado finally slipping into fear, and my daughter sat speechless, her lips trembling as the reality of her powerlessness sank in. In that moment, the balance shifted completely, and the two of them, who had once believed they held my fate in their hands, sat exposed, humiliated, and powerless before the man they had tried to destroy. The confrontation that had begun with her smug certainty ended with her collapse, and as the truth poured out like a flood, she could no longer contain her composure, her arrogance shattering in front of me until she looked less like the triumphant woman she imagined herself to be, and more like a cornered child, stripped of every excuse. Her face went pale as the documents lay spread across the table, each one a nail in the coffin of her lies. And when I reminded her that the notary she and her husband had bribed had already confessed under oath, she covered her mouth with a trembling hand, as if she could somehow hold back the humiliation rising in her throat. Her husband tried to speak for her, to bluster and bark, but the evidence silenced him as effectively as a gag. And when I explained that injunctions had been filed weeks earlier, ensuring that every attempt to seize my property was already dead in the water, the last of their bravado drained away. My daughter's voice broke when she finally tried to protest, saying I was ruining her life, that I was cruel for standing in the way of her future. But even as she spoke, she could see in my eyes that her words held no power anymore, that the mask she had worn for so long was gone forever. The social fallout came quickly, faster than I had anticipated, for the law moved swiftly once the case was presented, and the whispers spread like wildfire through our community. Friends and neighbors who had once seen her as a woman of charm and ambition now saw her as nothing more than a thief exposed in broad daylight. Invitations that had once flowed so easily dried up, doors that had once opened wide slammed shut, and soon she could no longer walk into a room without feeling the weight of eyes upon her, eyes that judged, eyes that remembered. Her arrogance, once a shield she carried proudly, became a curse. For the higher she had raised herself in her imagination, the harder she fell when everyone learned what she had done. Financially, the consequences were even harsher. Her schemes had left her vulnerable, debts unpaid, bribes uncovered, accounts frozen by the very authorities she thought she could manipulate. The savings she had so carelessly squandered on her husband's false promises of quick success evaporated, and soon they were left scrambling, stripped not only of what they tried to steal, but of the comfort they had once taken for granted. The lavish dinners, the designer clothes, the illusion of status, all crumbled into nothing, and for the first time in her life she was forced to taste the bitterness of going without, to understand the struggles I had borne silently for decades so that she would never know that pain. But it was the emotional consequences that cut the deepest, for humiliation is not just the loss of pride, it is the revelation of truth, and she could no longer pretend to herself that she was the dutiful daughter, the beloved child, the innocent victim of a selfish father. She was forced to look in the mirror and see the greed, the arrogance, the betrayal that had defined her choices, and though she tried at first to rage against me, to call me cruel and heartless, eventually the weight of her own actions bore down until even her fury faltered. She stood in front of me, stripped of power, stripped of pretense, stripped of everything but the knowledge that she had destroyed the bond we once shared, and for all her bluster and pride, there was no escaping the truth. She was humiliated, exposed, and broken by the very man she had believed too weak to fight back. When the dust finally settled and the storm of betrayal had passed, I found myself sitting once more in the quiet of my home, the same walls that had once pressed in on me, with the weight of grief now standing tall and proud around me, not as symbols of despair, but as testaments to endurance, to victory, to justice hard won. The evidence had been presented, the courts had sided firmly with me, and the fortress my lawyer and I had built had held strong against every desperate strike my daughter and her husband attempted. They had been stripped of their false claims, their forgeries exposed, their reputations shredded beyond repair, and as I sat with the official documents of ownership once again secure in my hands, I felt a peace I had not known in many long months. My sacrifices had not been wasted, not after all. For though my daughter had tried to erase me, though she had plotted to rob me of my dignity and my legacy, she had failed. And in her failure, I had proven to myself that every long hour of labor, every coin saved, every dream fought for had meant something. My work had not been stolen, my home had not been lost, and my life's achievements still stood firmly as my own. There was vindication not only in the law's judgment but in the shift inside me, for I no longer carried the hollow weight of helplessness, no longer sat drowning in sorrow. Instead, I held my head high, knowing that I had faced betrayal at its worst and had not been broken. The neighbors who had once whispered pity now spoke of respect, seeing in me not a victim but a man who had defended what was his with dignity and patience. Even as I walked through town, people would stop to tell me they admired my strength, that they were glad justice had prevailed, and though their words could not mend the wound my daughter had carved into my heart, they reminded me that I had not fought in vain. My lawyer shook my hand with quiet pride when the final rulings were delivered, telling me that few men could have endured what I had endured and emerged with such clarity, and I knew he was right. For the path had nearly destroyed me at times, yet now, sitting in the stillness of my home, I realized that the silence no longer mocked me, it comforted me. The laughter of betrayal had been silenced, the sneers of arrogance reduced to nothing, and what remained was my house, my land, my legacy, untouched by their greed. Though the bond with my daughter was shattered beyond repair, I no longer felt the same agony I once did, for grief had been replaced by resolve, sorrow by peace. I had given her everything a father could give, and though she had chosen betrayal, her failure proved that love and sacrifice are not erased so easily. Justice had been served, and in that justice I found vindication. My life's work was still mine, my dignity was intact, and I had shown not only her but myself that betrayal could wound, but it could not destroy. And as I stood at the window, looking out at the yard I had built, the home that bore the weight of my years, I felt an unshakable calm settle over me, for I knew at last that I had reclaimed my peace. The days after the confrontation and the legal battles carried a strange stillness, a quiet aftermath that felt both heavy and liberating. For while my home remained mine, my savings intact, and my dignity restored, I could not deny that something had been lost forever, something no court or lawyer could return to me, and that was the bond between father and daughter, the invisible thread I had spent a lifetime weaving with love and sacrifice, now snapped and frayed beyond repair. I walked through the house and saw the remnants of her childhood everywhere, the small height marks I once carved into the wall to measure her growth, the faded photographs on the mantel of her grinning face in school uniforms, the old toys boxed in the attic, and each sight carried both warmth and sorrow, a reminder that I had once believed those moments would grow into a lifelong bond of trust. Instead, they stood as relics of a relationship that had been buried by greed, monuments not to joy but to betrayal. And yet, as I sat with those memories, I realized that although she had chosen to destroy what we had, I had not been destroyed with it. I was still standing, stronger in some ways than I had ever been, my life's work still mine, my dignity intact, my spirit tested but not broken. The silence of the house, once unbearable, now felt like a kind of companion, a quiet acknowledgement that I had survived, that I had not let her treachery erase me. I thought of all the nights I had sat here drowning in grief, believing I was powerless, and I compared it to now, when I could look around and know that I had fought back and won. That victory did not erase the wound, but it gave me something else, empowerment. the knowledge that betrayal could strip away illusions, but not strength. I found myself reflecting less on what she had tried to take, and more on what I had preserved: my home, my legacy, my will to endure. I knew the bond with her was gone, and though it hurt to admit that I would never again look at her as the little girl who once held my hand, I also knew that letting her win would have been the true death of that love, and I had not allowed that. As the days stretched on, I learned to live with the absence, to accept that family is not always bound by blood, that sometimes survival means letting go of those who would destroy you. I did not celebrate her humiliation, nor did I rejoice in her downfall, but I carried the quiet satisfaction that justice had prevailed, that she had faced the consequences of her choices, and that I had safeguarded the life I had built with such sacrifice. In the end, the money and the property were not what mattered most. It was the dignity of knowing I had not surrendered, the empowerment of reclaiming my voice and my place. The quiet aftermath became not a void but a space for peace, and though the bond with my daughter was lost, I walked forward with the strength of a man who had faced betrayal and refused to be destroyed by it. I sit here now in the same chair where I once collapsed in grief, in the same house whose walls once echoed with silence that mocked me, and I realize that everything has come full circle. But I am no longer the broken man I was on that day when my lawyer first told me the terrible truth about my daughter. Betrayal cut me deeper than I thought possible. It shattered my trust. It tore apart the bond I believed unbreakable. And it forced me to look at my own flesh and blood not as the child I once adored, but as the adversary who sought to erase me. Yet through the pain, through the humiliation, through the nights when I wept alone in the dark, something inside me refused to die. And instead of crumbling, I rose. Instead of yielding, I fought. And in the end, I proved that even the cruelest betrayal cannot strip a man of his dignity if he refuses to let it. My daughter and her husband plotted with arrogance, thinking I was weak, thinking age had made me blind and soft. But they learned that the strength forged through sacrifice and hardship does not fade with the years. It sharpens, it hardens. And when they struck at me, I struck back with patience, with strategy, and with truth. They lost everything they sought to steal, and I remained standing, my home still mine, my name still mine, my legacy untouched. Do not mistake me, the wound remains, and the bond with my daughter lies in ruins that will never be rebuilt. But I speak these words now, not from sorrow but from triumph, because she did not destroy me, she did not erase me, and she did not claim what was never hers to take. Betrayal is a wound that leaves scars, but scars are not weakness. They are proof of survival, proof that you endured what others thought would break you. If you hear my story and carry one lesson from it, let it be this. No matter who turns against you, no matter how deep the treachery cuts, never let them take your dignity. Never let them silence your resolve. For justice may move slowly, but when it comes, it restores what matters most. I was betrayed by my own daughter, but I stand victorious, and though I have lost her, I have reclaimed myself. And in the end, that is the truest triumph of all. Your time means a lot. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.